D70s is by far the best topping DAC I've ever heard. It's one of the best DACs under 1000. But is it my favorite? Well, you know. Hi guys and welcome to my latest video. Now, what we are having here today is Topping D70s, and it's one of the best models that Topping produces. Well, it's not exactly their flagship DAC, because that spot belongs to D90, that I personally haven't heard, but D70s is the next in line, very close to it. And instead of using like flagship AK DAC chip, it uses chip that is next in line, but two of them. And as usual, I will not be focusing on tech specs and measurements and things like that, but I'll talk with you about its build quality, features, connectivity, and then mostly about sound quality, and then I'll compare it to some of my favorite DACs at this price point. That said, let's start with the build, as usual with Topping, a brand that makes even low-budget products almost completely out of aluminium and sturdy and great as expected. A 650 DAC is built great. It's quite thick aluminium, it feels sturdy, it feels solid, it's pretty weighty too, there's just nothing to complain here. But let's move to connectivity part here on the back, and as you can see we have IEC power inlet, meaning that the power supply is located inside of the unit, so no need for you to think is like that cheap power brick outside of the DAC good enough, should I purchase better linear power supply? That's already built in and it's of a pretty decent quality. But the story really gets interesting when we start talking about digital inputs. Now we have the usual ones such as USB, optical and coaxial SPDIF, but we also have some unusual ones such as AES and I2S. So as far as digital connectivity and inputs are concerned, there's basically everything you could ever need on this DAC. And when it comes to the output, it's also rich selection. We have standard RCA single-ended out and balanced XLR output. Interesting thing, if you put this DAC in a fixed mode, that is actually a DAC mode, these are of a little bit higher voltage than usual, meaning that RCA single-ended will have 2.5 volts, which is a little bit higher than usual 2 volts, while XLR outputs, balanced outputs, will have 5 volts, which is again a little bit higher than usual 4 volts. Have that in mind if you test and compare this DAC to something other, it will sound slightly louder, you need to volume match first. And that said, it's actually a good time to tell you that D70s, as most DACs these days, can act as a preamp too. You can put it in a variable output mode. If you wish to do so, you can use it as a preamp. Now let's quickly turn it on so I can show you how the front panel looks. Now, as you can see, there is a very nice and readable LED display in the front. It's black and white. And everything you need to do with a DAC, you can do either by using these buttons on the front panel or provided remote control. So let me quickly guide you through a few functions and settings that you can change on this DAC. So starting, you can see actually on the screen right in the middle, it says DAC. That means it's in a DAC mode currently. You can change that to a preamp mode. I will not be doing that because it would require me to power it down just to show you that you can change volume. But let's see what else can you do. So first thing that you can do is actually to change the brightness of the display. Low, medium, high and automatic. Then you can of course choose different inputs, and finally you can change filters. There are 6 of them, and as far as D70s goes, I noticed that mode 4 is the brightest sounding one. It's like most analytical with shortest decay, so it's kinda most analytical sounding one. And the owner that loaned me this unit actually prefers this mode because his speakers, in his own words, lack a little bit of highest spectrum extension. But in my own system, that one didn't sound as good. I preferred basically anything else, number 1, 2, 3. I do not hear much difference between most of these modes. Some of them are a little bit sweeter and maybe slower sounding. Some of them are a little bit sharper sounding. But I definitely know that number 4 is the sharpest and most analytical sounding one. And it didn't suit my personal taste and my personal system that well. So I actually tested most of the time in mode 1 and mode 3, that is actually a default factory mode. You should of course listen that for yourself and decide which one suits you and your system best. And last very neat option is, I'm not sure is it this auto on or off or display automatic, but actually by using one of these options you can make D70s to turn its display off automatically when you are not meddling with any controls. And I believe that is really nice because this is OLED display, I believe, so that way you're saving it, you're making it last longer, and a lot of people actually, oh yeah, here it goes. And some people just like when display is not powered on. So all of that said and done, how does D70s actually sound? To put it simply, it sounds great. It really sounds great. As I mentioned in the intro, it's the best sounding topping DAC that I have ever heard. First of all, bassline. I really like its bassline. It can go deep when that's needed. But don't make a mistake and think about a deep bass line as something emphasized and warm, because it's not. It goes deep, but it's actually pretty neat, pretty tidy, it's quick bass. And I would say that Topping actually struck a great balance between making the bass line nimble and clean and very agile, but at the same time it has weight. It gives like a very solid core to every tone that we are listening. And between some DACs that give a little bit emphasized warmer bass response and some DACs that are all about speed and agility and striking fast and hard, I would say this is pretty much like ideal mix of speed and resolution on one side and weight and presence of the bass on the other side. So pretty much one of my favorite bass lines that I've heard at near this price point. And moving up the frequency spectrum, things are continuing in a very similar fashion. So for example, mid-bass again, it's not dried out, but it's not emphasized either. I really feel that there's just the right amount of mid-bass and lower mid-range. So instruments and vocals, they sound rich. I don't feel anything is thin or sharp or anything, but the resolution is great. The speed again is great of this DAC. We have a lot of really crisp, clean edges, but they're done in a way that they're never too analytical, too clawy or anything like that. So there is quite a bit of smoothness and liquidity to the sound of this DAC, and that's why I'm especially happy. And the highest frequency spectrum is quite extended. It's again very detailed, very revealing, but not in an annoying kind of way. It is, in my opinion, on a slightly brighter side of things. It's very open, it's very airy, but again, it's pretty smooth. It's not grainy, it's not overly sharp trying to claw into your brain. It's just very open, extended, and present highest spectrum. And that actually leads me to some other traits of the DAC and of its sound. Now, when it comes to sound staging, I can say D70s is doing a really decent job. The sound stage is as wide as I ever heard it, anywhere below 1000. Also, depth is quite reasonable. And all of the instruments, vocals, basically every tone that you can hear from a recording is nicely placed in its position. It has enough room, enough space around it, so layering is really nice. And lastly, this is not a thin and flat sounding DAC dynamically. So in terms of dynamics, bass has enough of weight, enough of punch. Edges have enough of energy and zest to them. So I never felt that the sound is flat and boring and uninvolving. Just listening to this DAC in an isolation, I was pretty happy with its sound. It sounded to me like a very neutral DAC, very open up top, but with a really nicely balanced mid-range and weighty yet nimble and resolving bass line. But that said, it's actually time to compare it to some other DACs and see where it really stands. So first comparison that I did, because I was very interested to compare these two, was with Topping Zone D30 Pro that I recently reviewed. It's slightly cheaper at 400s. As you can see, it's also smaller. It came a little bit later to the market, but it's using 4 Cyrus Logic DA converters. I can say that immediately you notice some tonal difference first. For example, D30 Pro has warmer bass line. It's also a little bit slower and less resolving. In most songs, what you hear is actually somewhat emphasized, more oomph in the bass line of D30 Pro. But you'll notice that it doesn't really go as deep as D70s can. And when it comes to like punch and intent of every bass note, that's also a little bit better on D70s. So this one feels warmer and more emphasized, but at the same time slower and not that impactful. And in the upper registers, even though you don't notice that on its own when you're just listening D30 Pro, D30 Pro actually has somewhat grainier sound, with D70s feeling smoother, just squeaky clean. You notice that when you compare them directly. Also, D70s sounds somewhat wider, and it layers, positions things better than D30 Pro. So the difference is not huge, but basically in every aspect, D70s is doing everything a little bit better. When you put all of that together, in my mind and for my system, if I had to choose between these two, I would probably gladly pay the $250 more for D70s, because in my mind, it's worth it. Now, it's pretty similar story if I would compare D70s with SMSL SU-9. Actually, the owner of this D70s that loaned it to me is actually the same nice guy that loaned SU-9 to me, and he has both of these DACs at the moment. As he noticed himself, I completely agree with him, SU-9 offers a little bit emphasized bass line, somewhat more punchy bass line, and that sounds very attractive. But in my mind, there is no question that D70s is more neutral sounding, it has more resolving bass line, mid-bass too, and basically everything else. You can just more easily hear what's going on the sound stage and where everything really is. And I can only agree with the owner of both of these that I actually prefer D70s. It's not just about preference, I think it is a slightly better DAC overall. And that actually leads me to much more fair comparison with Denafrips Ares II. And I can immediately tell you this is going to be a tough one. I'm trying not to be biased because I own this one and I clearly like its sound signature. In comparison to D70s, it sounds different. It has different tonality and different qualities. I'll start by saying that overall, I find these two performing at the similar level. I would say personally that they're equally good DACs, and that choosing between these two will depend solely on your own preferences and your own system. D70s is definitely more precise sounding, meaning it has more clearly defined edges, it has quicker, clearer transients. And that starts from the bass line actually. It feels more nimble, it feels faster. If you're following some sort of double bass, for example, you will follow quick changes and quick plucks of strings more easily with D70s. On the other hand, Ares will lend a little bit of warmth and a little bit of oomph to the bass line. And even though it cannot go deeper than D70s, in fact, I think D70s can play deeper bass notes. Most of the times, bass line, because of that slight warmth and oomph given, feels like a bassier sounding DAC. It feels like it has denser bass line with more grunt. But that's actually coming from that slightly higher bass response, because most of the instruments don't really go to the sub-bass levels. But if you're listening to some electronic music, D70s will actually have more sub-bass punch and more sub-bass power. But with acoustic instruments such as bass guitar, double bass, etc., it will feel like Ares is creating heftier bass. And it's very similar when it comes to the mid-range. Again, Ares II is giving a little bit of boost to the fullness and to the lushness of vocals. It creates both vocals and instruments that sound a little bit fuller and more palpable in space. So for example, between my speakers, there is a vocal in the center, and I feel it's a slightly more present, palpable, and three-dimensional with Ares II. And that goes for most instruments too. However, D70s is capable of etching them with greater precision. If something quickly changes, if a quick pluck of a string happens, D70s follows that quicker. Ares is a little bit slower, a little bit softer in terms of microdynamics. Also, D70s, basically all across the frequency spectrum, D70s do sound cleaner and smoother. Like the tone itself, its texture is a little bit more glossy, a little bit more liquidy, while Ares, in comparison, sounds a little bit grainy. It's like comparing a very new movie production with great clarity, with like digital cameras and you can see every tiny detail, with a little bit older movie that's filmed on an analog camera, on a film, and you can actually see that film grain, that slight noise on the picture. And that said, if I was dissecting the sound point by point, I definitely feel that I would give more points to D70s. But when I start listening to the music, I value very much this thing that RS is doing great, and that's giving that dense character to tones, that's palpability to both vocals and bass line and everything. And I truly believe there is no easy answer here. Preferring each of these will depend on your own preferences and the rest of your system. For example, a friend that loaned me D70s has told me that his speakers have quite healthy bass output, but they're a little bit tame when it comes to highest frequencies, and he really likes the sound of Topping. He prefers it in terms of tonality to SMSL SU-9, that's more like punchy in the bass line. And that also means he would probably prefer it to RS2 in his own system. I'm almost sure that would happen. In my own system, with Hegel amp and CAF LS50s that are quite analytical sounding, I do slightly prefer RS2, and I really believe this would change from one system to the other and from one listener to the other. This also leads me to one last comparison, and that would be with SMSL M400 that I don't have with me anymore, but that one is even warmer sounding than RS2. It's even more lush sounding in mid-range and has kinda tame high frequencies, which both D70s or RS2 don't have. So M400 is like on completely opposite side of things. It's much more warmer, lusher sounding DAC. That said, I do feel that D70s is more neutral and more true to the source. It does sound somewhat more flat. M400 gives that honey glaze, that warmth, that lushness, making like vocals fuller than life. I think I would probably personally in my own system, just for enjoyment, rather listen to M400, but if I objectively have to say which one is of a higher fidelity, I would have to say D70s. And with that, I think it's time to make a conclusion. D70s is definitely the best Topping DAC that I've tried so far. It's also one of the best sub $1,000 DAC that I've ever heard. In my mind, D70s, Denafrips Ares II and SMSL M400 are equally great. They're three best DACs that I've heard at this price range, with M400 clearly being the warmest sounding one, D70s being the most neutral, quickest, most nimble sounding one, and RS2 having its own thing of being dense and palpable, three-dimensional, but at the same time a little bit slower and grittier sounding than D70s. All of that said and done, it's also worth mentioning that D70s is the cheapest among all of these mentioned. And I can only say that D70s is both great DAC and especially great value. So if you're not against that quite flat, quite neutral approach that Topping is taking with its DACs, it's a really good choice. And that would be all for today, guys. Thank you for watching. If you liked the video, then click that button, share it with your friends. If you really liked it, then consider becoming a patron maybe. Anyway, see you next time. Bye.